All right, Brenda's going to charge you by the hour now. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to pick up with panel 2, and our returning folks will be will return quietly and gently, and I will get my paperwork organized eventually. All right, so we tried to take this program through a logical sequence where we started with some of the bigger principles, starting with the financial community, the legal community. But during that first panel, if you're not intimately familiar with Canadian processes in American, processes in Canadian, we thought it might be helpful to just take a moment and speak to some people who are intimately familiar with the Canadian government obligations and First Nations responses to that. The panel is actually called Partnership with Indigenous People and the Government of Canada. And the folks that we have on our short and mighty panel, wait for it, I've just lost my piece of paper. There we go. Are Corey Dekker from NRCan, National Resources Department of Natural Resources Canada, and Joe Daniels, co-chair of the Indigenous Advisory and Monitoring Committee and a member of the George Gordon First Nation. And he makes Regina his home. Regina?
Correct.
Right. And you do a lot of activities. So you got Aboriginal sports manager, Sask Sport. You got a bunch of kids. You are in motion pretty much all the time, right?
Pretty much. Yeah.
Well, we're delighted that you could come here. I also want to point out a lot of our speakers today, when you do a First Nations consultation resource event, means people have to travel a long way. So, you know, give a little silent acknowledgement to folks who have traveled a long way to come here. It is, we can tell you, not easy to get to Washington from Saskatchewan, Alberta, etc. Corey Dekker, sitting immediately to my left, your right, is a senior advisor and Secretariat, is the senior advisor, Indigenous Partnerships Office West, which means he doesn't have to suffer through Ottawa winters. He's in Vancouver for the Department of Natural Resources Canada, which you're going to hear us call NRCan from time to time. He's been working on the Line 3 Indigenous and Advisory and Monitoring Committee. Yeah, it is. And he's going to tell us why that's important and why that particular exercise is scalable. And so who wants to speak first? Is it going to be you first, Corey, and then Joe? You're going to help us figure out how the sausage gets made in Indigenous government partnerships in Canada. Please.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Laura. And thanks for the invite, and thanks to the Wilson Center for hosting this event and for inviting Joe and I to come and talk about this work that we've been doing for the last close to 2 years now. But just maybe to take a step back in terms of the context in Canada. So the Government of Canada is committed to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and you see that kind of fleshed out in many different ways in Canada. You see that in the certainly speeches from the throne. You see that if you look at annual federal budgets. You see that in the legislative agenda that the Government of Canada has. Lots of legislation in the House. We heard pieces referenced that are in the Senate in relation to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous issues. You see that in kind of a renewed focus on settling land claim agreements, entering into new treaties. You see that in the mandate letters that the Prime Minister has issued to each of the ministers in Canada. And those mandate letters are important because they set the direction that the direction that each minister is tasked with, and each of them has an expression that in government we've committed to memory because it's there in every mandate letter. And the Prime Minister says that there's no relationship more important to him or to Canada than the one with Indigenous peoples, and so it's direction right from the top in terms of this commitment to reconciliation. Within my department, Natural Resources Canada, some of what that means is, we have as a department a priority. Reconciliation is a priority for the department. We are doing things like prioritizing Indigenous traditional knowledge and working in partnerships with Indigenous peoples. We're working to consult and engage Indigenous peoples early and meaningfully, and as well placing emphasis on enhancing relationships around all kinds of projects, including energy infrastructure projects. And it's that specific focus that gave rise to the specific project that Joe and I have been working on for the last year and a half, which is the Indigenous Advisory and Monitoring Committee for the Line 3 replacement program. So I think, yeah, and maybe just another word, another thing that my department, Natural Resources Canada, has done in recent years is created the office that I work for. So I work for a sector within the department called the Indigenous Partnerships Office West. We're headquartered in Vancouver with a mandate to build relationships, to build partnerships with Indigenous groups in Western Canada around energy issues. So we work across all the prairie provinces, and that I think that kind of well understood that the creation of our sector and our office and having a mandate initially not tied to any specific project, really focusing on relationships and partnerships, is quite unique and novel within the federal government. So just I think just jump in to talk about the specific project that Joe and I have been working on. We do have a two-pager at the table out front on the IAMC. So maybe a bit of context for this. So, November 2016, the government is faced with a decision on a couple of projects, including the Line 3 project, and one of the very clear interests that Indigenous groups had mentioned throughout the regulatory review process and throughout the consultation process was a desire to be involved with the government and with the regulator being the National Energy Board. We heard the federal regulators, the NEB, we heard that mentioned earlier. So they regulate projects that cross a border. It crosses a provincial border or an international border. It's a federally regulated pipeline, as this one is. So this interest in being involved, not just so if this goes ahead, if the project is approved, Indigenous groups saying we want to be involved throughout the entire life cycle of the project. During the construction phase, we want to be involved during the operational phase, and we want to be involved in any kind of decommissioning phase. So this initiative, this IAMC, Indigenous Advisory and Monitoring Committee, that the Government of Canada has created in partnership with the regulator and with Indigenous groups all along the right-of-way, is a table, a forum, a committee where that exactly that is happening, where we come together on a monthly basis. We've got a number of subcommittees that meet on a weekly basis, and involved in conversation, all focused around providing Indigenous perspective on issues, on regulation, on policy, on governance, on an ongoing basis, through dialogue and through partnership. On the two-pager we talk about the structure there. This was created through a co-development process. So as government officials, we had very little by way of marching orders. It was a process that we invited all impacted Indigenous groups. We welcomed them all in to sit down with the government and government officials and try and sort out what this committee is going to look like, what its mandate will be in terms of the specifics, what its priorities will be, what its structure will be, what the representative model would be. So, we're dealing with a project with more than 100 Indigenous groups. Impractical to have a 100-member committee, so we needed some kind of representation model. So we had to figure that out together through that co-development process, and eventually we did. Eventually we got to a place where we had consensus on terms of reference, the result of about 11 months of work, and endorsement from Indigenous groups across the prairies, as well as the minister representing the government and the chair of the regulator. So that all came together in October of last year, and the committee's now been operating for 1 year. We have 16 Indigenous representatives on that committee, including Joe Daniels. Joe also has the title of the Indigenous co-chair. So the committee is chaired by, there's 2 co-chairs. There's a government co-chair, and there's an Indigenous co-chair, and Joe is our excuse me, Indigenous co-chair. So that's kind of a quick overview of context and the project and the initiative. And maybe just to give kind of one practical example of what this committee is doing, and something which we're really proud of, those of us that work on it, involves monitoring. So we have a federal regulator in Canada, the National Energy Board. We mentioned that. They have inspection program. They have inspectors. They perform inspections on the line. Before this program came around, those inspectors operated under a legislative, as they still do, they operate under a legislative mandate. Now, as a result of this program, when they conduct inspections, they have Indigenous monitors that accompany them. So that come from the impacted communities along the right-of-way. So, the idea here is that it's Indigenous involvement. It's providing Indigenous perspective on things that are happening out on the land. It's sharing a perspective that the regulator has said, obviously that they don't have. And so now all of the inspections that have been happening since this summer have been this model where you have regulatory inspectors paired up with Indigenous monitors that are coming from those communities. And so that's something that we're quite proud of. It's something that's new in Canada, and it's the first of its kind, and it's all a result of this work that we've been doing through the Indigenous Advisory Monitoring Committee.
Okay, I'm going to ask the simple-minded question from the slightly cynical person. So we have the law of Canada, and we have international law practice saying that the company has got to consult with Indigenous communities. We have financial companies like Olga saying this makes good business sense to do so, and of course the energy companies as well. Why is government in there as well? What are you doing that is a complement and not an overlap to this process? And I'm going to ask you, yeah, it's very core. You get this one. I got the easy ones for Joe. Maybe the hard ones too.
Well, everything you said I think is true. I think what's new about this initiative, though, is the role of government and is the role of the regulator here. So I think it's been well understood, and it was mentioned on previous panels that proponents, we heard financial institutions, are kind of aware of the importance of relationships with Indigenous communities. But this committee and this initiative gets at what's the role of government on an ongoing basis, and what's the role of the regulator on an ongoing basis in partnerships with Indigenous groups around these kinds of issues and these kinds of projects. And so this is a government initiative. This is one, as I mentioned, which involves the regulator and is providing perspective and the Indigenous perspective at every level of how the project is regulated, and where there are issues that are identified that are broader issues, broader policy issues. The fact that the government is at the table is a forum or a venue into pursuing broader dialogue around maybe there is a need for policy change of some kind, and then we have a mandate to, the committee does, to, if they think that policy needs to be changed or legislation needs to be changed to address a specific issue, that they have a mandate to formulate options and to provide advice to the government on how to address those. Okay.
So over to you, Joe. What do you think of this process? How did you get involved in it, and how should we understand it?
Well, good AA, first of all.
Good AA.
Thanks, Laura, for inviting us down here. It's great to be here in Washington. I just want to go back to kind of where I became involved and how our First Nation was involved. We were part of the application process. We participated in the hearings in Ottawa with the National Energy Board. And I guess from that, we wanted to stay involved with the project. We've got a very good relationship. George Gordon First Nation has a very good relationship with Enbridge. We've got a couple of benefit agreements that we have with Enbridge. And from that, we wanted to stay involved. We've got, we basically, the chief and council, there's a nomination process for the IMAC. And so I was part of the drafting team with the terms of reference, helped with the composition. I think it's really important that we recognize that it's not just First Nations that are on this committee. We have the Métis Nation as well. In Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba, there's a strong Métis Nation. They're very active. They are part of our committee as well. But basically, it's kind of morphed to where the people on the committee and the nations they represent, we all want to be involved. We all feel that this is a great opportunity for Indigenous community to have a say. And most people around our table, I think we feel privileged and honored to be on this committee. We work with the National Energy Board, we work with the Secretariat as well, but we also try and communicate as best we can back to those affected nations along the line. And I think, at the end of the day, this is a model. It's something that's never been done in Canada before. And I think it's going to be something that industry and the government are going to look towards this committee to have that say or that involvement where Indigenous communities can sit at a table and have dialogue around whether it's policy change or, there's an act that was mentioned earlier, Bill C-69, that maybe we can have some influence on where we never had that, that influence before, so to speak. So from my perspective, it's been a really good experience for me. My First Nation is we're still very involved. We actually have monitors on the project through the Aboriginal Construction program with Enbridge. We also, Corey mentioned our monitoring program with the IMAC. We have a member on there as well. So, we never had this 3 or 4 years ago as a nation or even as an individual, Joe Daniels. And for us to participate, it's just been a really good experience. And I think, it really is going to set a framework for future energy projects in Canada.
What does your community, what do they expect from you as you're the representative? How do you build consensus? How are you the conduit between the committee and your community back home?
Well, consensus sometimes is tough. Consensus, I think folks have a different definition of consensus. I think from my perspective, we want to try and have that dialogue around the table and as best we can. We have 16 members, so it's quite a large committee. And, First Nation, Métis, we've got members from the Secretariat and the National Energy Board that sit at the table. So to have all those various people come to the table, sometimes it's been difficult. But I think at the end of the day, the intention is to try and reach that consensus where we can provide that advice back to the National Energy Board. And in some cases, we work with Enbridge as well. They come and visit us at our table. And I think, it's really important that, to try and achieve consensus as best we can. But going back to our First Nation, it's all about communicating where that communication wasn't there prior. So if my First Nation decided that they wanted to look into this project, they'd have to go and figure that out on their own. Where now we have this mechanism where if there's information we like to share, we share that with all our affected nations along that line through the right of way. So, not only do we have an opportunity to participate fully, but we also have that opportunity to listen and to see what's actually going on within the National Energy Board and even the project itself, right? So that's never been there before. So we're very happy to have that.
Can you tell me about some of the specific benefits that this project has brought to your nation, or that you expect it to bring to your nation, and also some of the specific concerns or areas that are maybe problematic? Yeah.
So the committee is, we're non-prejudicial, and I think that's really important to express. We're not for or against, For sure on George Gordon First Nation, we have community members that are for and against the pipeline, right? But I think, it's important that we listen to those folks, whether it's pro or against, and try and make that determination of how best we can help out our community, as well as those nations across the line. Specifically for George Gordon First Nation, I did mention that we have people working, and I think that's really important. A couple of years ago, you know, when National Energy Board gave approval for this project, George Gordon has always been kind of you know, I don't want to say a leader, but, you know, we had the foresight that, you know what, we need to start getting ready for this project. It affects our area. You know, working with Enbridge, one of the benefit agreements we had with them was to produce a traditional land use study. And I think out of that, basically that helps us get our foot in the door, so to speak. So I think that's a benefit to our community of understanding our traditional land use. I think the second benefit was, you know, actually having people employed. But we've struck an environmental company as well a couple years ago, and you know, through the Line 3 replacement project, there's activity within our business there. So we have a business arm, and I think this environmental company has just complemented a lot of other activities that we have with the project. So, you know, it's been a lot of benefit and a lot of very little negative.
Yeah.
So.
So Corey, you've been sort of working your way through a bit of a prototype process, if I can say that. A lot of learning by doing. What are some of the lessons learned that you have from the Line 3 experience? And do you think it's scalable and adaptable to future projects?
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe I'll deal with the second part first, which is the scalability question. I think no question. You know, I think this is a project that involves, as I mentioned, more than 100 Indigenous groups. So it's hard to imagine, you know, a project, you know, in terms of scale that would be much bigger than that. I mean, there may be. Scalable to other contexts? I think so. It's only our first year. So I think, you know, I think the lessons that we've learned around, you know, collaborative partnerships, committing to a co-development process I think is an important lesson that we learned. You know, I think the lesson there is that was really instrumental in building support, building consensus ultimately for agreement on a terms of reference, that it wasn't an initiative where, you know, as government officials, everything had been kind of mapped out. We had a few parameters, but really it was, let's figure this out together. And that's been the spirit of this whole initiative, is as we sit around the table every month, and as subcommittees meet, you know, on a weekly basis, in some cases, it's all around this idea of how can we figure this out together. We're all coming at it from different perspectives, government and Indigenous, but even within Indigenous, incredible diversity of views. And the conversation, you know, really focusing though on those areas where we can find agreement and those areas where we can find consensus. So that commitment at the outset to a co-development, I think that's certainly an important lesson in the first year, and in getting support for the initiative from the outset. You know, I think you know, some other important things that we've learned is, I think the institutional commitment. So, you know, if I was advising other government officials about this, I think really key will be a very significant institutional investment, and by that I mean, and commitment, and by that I mean, from, in our case in Canada, from the minister on down, there's been a incredible commitment to this initiative. You know, in Canada we have deputy ministers, and in this initiative our deputy minister has been incredibly involved. So that's the top public servant in the department, incredibly involved, you know, on the ground in coming to meetings, building relationships, meeting with, during the co-development, meeting with representatives, as a committee, meeting with committee members. So from that level, you know, that just kind of permeates through the organization, that this is something that the government takes seriously, is committed to, and I think that's been kind of well understood and received by our Indigenous partners.
I'm going to take a couple of questions, but before I do, I have another question for Joe. If you were going to advise somebody else, maybe not necessarily in Canada, maybe somebody in the United States, who was going to participate in a similar exercise as a representative from an Indigenous community, what would be your best advice to them?
Well, I think, from what I've learned here last 2.5 years is an open mind, an open heart. But I heard one of the speakers up here earlier is keeping in mind that, we're not talking about today or tomorrow. This is a 7-generation type thoughts that we have to, get our heads around. So, just to be sure, but open heart, open mind, and just, be willing to help out the cause, right? And contribute as best you can.
Thank you. All right, questions or comments that are shaped like questions? Microphone to Aaron, please.
Thanks to both of you. It's really interesting to hear about this. And now, given that, and correct me if I'm wrong, this committee was sort of the first of its kind that we've done in Canada. So now that there's also a similar committee that's been stood up for Trans Mountain expansion, and presumably there'll be others in the future for future projects. Were there lessons coming out of this where you had aspects where you said, okay, this could have worked better if we had done it this way, and are you passing that information along to sort of the TMX committee, or sharing those lessons learned with each side?
Sure. Yeah. Well, certainly. I do think while it's been a year, I think it is maybe a bit early for us to be I think we have learned some lessons in the first year, but I think we're still learning what those lessons are. I think we've got some great successes under our belt in the first year. I mentioned one that everyone is proud of, which was this monitoring program. But in terms of broader lessons, I think we're just kind of now getting at the stage, given it is the 1 year. The most recent meeting that this committee had was really focused on, now that it is the 1 year, we need to put our heads together as a committee and formulate an annual report, which we're required to do, but also getting, wanting to speak to that question specifically. If someone else was to be setting up a committee like this, what advice would this committee give them now that they've been in operations for a year? So I think that's all I would say. What do you think, Joe?
Well, I think, from when I look at kind of how this committee has gotten to where we are today, I guess the takeaway or the thing that I would, try and recommend later to the government is, if you're looking at striking these committees, try and strike them within a reasonable timeline where, we're in scope or in line with the project. Basically, the project had been started already, and the committee was struck after, so construction was already commenced. So the trick for us here in the first year was trying to catch up. And I think right now where we are 1 year later is we're at that point now where we're caught up. So we can start giving that advice back to the National Energy Board, start taking a look at Bill C-69 to see if we can have any influence. But that would be my advice, I guess, is to try and align things where we're not putting people in a committee in a position where we have to catch up. So that's been the struggle from my perspective here in the first year. I don't know if that answered your question, Aaron.
Yeah.
Okay.
The lady with the yellow sweater and the lady with the purple down front. So one there and one there. To our intrepid microphone runners, Marisol and Truitt. Are you Truitt? Hi, Truitt. Thank you. So you can give that mic to the lady in the purple, but the lady in the yellow will go first.
So my question is, I know at least in the U.S., we don't really work a lot with federally unrecognized tribes. I don't really remember how that entirely works in Canada. So say if you have a tribe who doesn't have certain treaty rights, do you guys still, do they still have a say in what goes on, or are they not communicated with as much?
Great question.
Yes, thank you for that question. So in the 3 prairie provinces where this project is, the line is running through, there's treaty. So treaty's been signed. The Métis Nation as well, they're entrenched in our Constitution. I think it was back in 1982 as well. So, there's a relationship there that's been there prior, even before the pipelines were ever in the ground, right? So that's kind of the perspective from Saskatchewan anyway. I'm a member of Treaty 4. It's kind of southeast Saskatchewan. It goes into a little bit of Manitoba and a little bit down into the States as well. Did that help you out or answer your question? Or okay.
Yeah.
BC's non-treaty, yeah. There are some areas within Canada for sure that are non-treaty, but specifically for our work, our area, we're operating within a treaty area and not, multiple treaties.
I went to UBC and I know a lot of the tribes that
And welcome to another fellow UBC grad. Lady in purple.
Yeah, thank you so much for this panel. I've had the experience of working in Africa on, with committees that involve Indigenous people who may have to make decisions. For example, the causes of oil spills and assigning those causes, the size of the spills, and so on. You've described a committee which sounds almost too good to be true in the sense that I didn't hear much about any disagreements. What happens in your committee if there are some members who simply don't agree?
Great question.
Corey, I'll let you take
Corey,
that one.
ask the guy from the government.
So yeah, so I think we, as I mentioned, there's a great diversity of views, and we've got 16 Indigenous members around a table, and not everyone often agrees. But we have built into our process kind of a decision-making or a governance model which allows for members to register concern, to register opposition to a particular decision that the committee is considering, and for that to be recorded. But we then, but there's still the kind of the ultimate question of do they the language we use is, are they blocking a particular course of action? So an item comes to the table, there's a vote, yeses, abstains, opposed. Everyone gets to articulate, their view, explain why they're voting the way they are. But then there's an ultimate question around important matters, financial matters, where we do need consensus. Is do they understand why, say, a majority of the committee are moving in a particular direction, and are they comfortable, or are they comfortable at least with that going forward, even though they're opposed or even though they're abstaining? And so we've kind of worked up this model where I think we can capture those views, but still I think allow people and allow the committee as a whole to kind of step back and make decisions as a collective. So that has happened a number of times, and so far nobody's blocked a particular decision, a decision where this kind of governance model kicked in. No one's blocked anything, but people have been opposed to things, as a group, and I think through that we create space for conversation, and sometimes there are certain issues that the committee will discuss for months before they actually get to a point where at least there's sufficient consensus with moving forward, even though there's a few individuals who may vote against something, but they will clarify that they're not blocking. So that I don't know. I hope that answers your question. This is kind of one of the technicalities of kind of how the committee makes decisions, but as a model, I think so far it's worked for us. Be interested to hear what you think, Joe.
Yeah, it's the message that we try and promote within our committee is having the patience. This is the first time this has ever happened in Canada, and I don't think this committee's perfect by no means, and I think there's some trial and error, but a lot of our whether it's a disagreement or I don't necessarily see that point or agree to it, we afford that opportunity for that dialogue so that everybody can have a well-informed decision when it's time to make a decision. So it's, I think we're going to learn through this process. Again, I mentioned earlier, consensus with 16 members, spread across 3 provinces, First Nation and Métis, it's difficult at times. But it's just like Corey said, it's affording that opportunity to have that dialogue and to have a deeper understanding on that particular decision item that we're looking at.
We're at the end of our time, and you don't have a microphone, so the people back there can't hear you. So, no, sorry. You'll have to catch them at the break, which, as it turns out, now that I've got us back on schedule, I realize that I have done myself out of a restroom break personally, because I'm also the moderator of the next panel. So, Joe, Corey, thank you so much. That was really interesting. I think it was the beginning of a conversation, so I hope we can carry it on in the corridors and at the reception. Thank you.
Thank you.